Okay. Was there any questions you guys have that were prompted through the breakout room conversation that you want me to address? All right. So I'll just jump into my notes. They're brief because I really want to hear from you guys more than hear myself speak. So the title of the speech is entitled "I've Been to the Mountaintop." Right. And if you think about the end of the speech, you know why that got that name. Couple of the key points that I found from the speech, right? He makes the claim that the unity among the enslaved will signify the end of enslavement, right? And he uses Egypt as an example, and he says one of the things that the Pharaoh did was making sure that those who were enslaved were always at odds with each other, right? But once the enslaved could come together and unify, then the institution of enslavement could end. Um, you hear in his speech the human rights revolution, right? So you hear him being attentive to the human rights issues that are facing people of culture throughout the world or people of color throughout the world, and he calls that the human rights revolution. Okay. He's organizing for workers' rights, calling for the United States to live up to what they claim to be and what they put on their paper, like the Constitution and things of that nature. So what that is a moral and an ethical critique against America. And then there's the intersection between politics and religion. Um, a little bit different in the way that Malcolm articulates it, but the premise is the same in the sense that he's concerned with preachers who are willing to involve themselves in the human rights struggle, right? And he says, if you are a preacher, that should be what you're doing. Um, and then, there's a shift where he's really focusing on the poor. He's focusing on the poor people's movement. That's something that you don't hear a lot about from Dr. King because again, they don't tap into his later years. Um, and then he also critiques preachers who are solely self-interested, right? So they're not willing to engage in the human rights struggle. They're not willing to engage in the civil rights struggle. They only worry about their tithe, their offering, and making sure that their situation is okay. Um, and then he understands, and he really towards the end of the speech, he really focuses it, and he's really attentive to the black economic power base, right? And this is where he says things like economic boycotts of Coca-Cola could become useful because it allows these companies and these industries to see the power that the black dollar holds, right? And then the last thing for me, there was a urgency in Dr. King's speech, right? And again, keep in mind when thinking about this urgency, this was the last speech that he gave before he was assassinated, right? So that kind of speaks to this urgency. So that's all I have. We'll open it up to the fishbowl. Again, remember, if you have fishbowl twice, you're done. You only have one opportunity to skip, and you need to fishbowl 2 times to get full credit for your participation. We are coming towards the end of the semester, so your opportunities to fishbowl are limited. Is there anyone who wants to volunteer?
I'll go.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
I'll go too.
Okay, Victor. Victor, this is your second one, correct?
Honestly, I'm not sure. I don't remember.
Okay. I haven't written down, so I'll be able to go back. But anybody else want to volunteer? All right, I'll call at random. Sergio, how do you feel about volunteering? Or sorry, how do you feel about fish bowling today?
Oh yeah, I guess I could go.
Okay, and then keep in mind, you guys, you could talk about what was discussed in the breakout rooms. You could talk about what I just mentioned in the brief lecture, or just whatever comes to mind. So there's no wrong way to do the fishbowl. So for our fishbowl today, for Group A, it will be Sergio, it will be Victor, and it'll be Ililia, excuse me. And I will shut up at this point. So whoever wants to go, it's on you.
Basically, I feel the way the Malcolm X and Malcolm X retaliates more like of a violence route. However, Martin Luther King uses like more of a peace uses more of a peaceful route in his speech. and then they both spoke about how to obtain like civil rights. And I also think the differences about their tone and their speeches were different. And then a similarity they had with their tones, they were both like super passionate about their speeches.
Sergio, what are some of the differences though about the tone? Because you mentioned the differences of the tone, but you didn't kind of go into what those differences were.
Like the differences, basically how like Malcolm X he retaliates through more of like like a violent way.
Okay, I got you. My fault. When I heard you said, I was thinking that you're going to talk about the distinctions between their tone. So I misunderstood you, but I got you.
Uh-huh.
Is there anything else you want to add?
No, that's pretty much it.
Okay. Thank you, Sergio. Who wants to go next?
I'll go next. So pretty much adding exactly like what Sergio said, one of the main differences I did find between the Martin Luther King speech and Malcolm X is that Martin Luther King does hold like more of a defensive view. Like he's saying we can't give up, or like we've come this way or we've come this far, and to just like throw it away, like it's not worth it. So we need to continue sticking together, continue fighting through this mess. Whereas Malcolm X has a more offensive view, like we need to keep pushing, and his words are more, he, I don't know how to say it, he kind of mocks or makes fun of the white people more compared to to Martin Luther King, where or I don't recall Martin Luther King even like referring to the white people like in any calling them names, like how Malcolm X called them Dixiecrats, I think he said, or something like that. And yeah, just their tone, Martin Luther King has a more calm, like reassuring voice compared to Malcolm X, where he has a more like strong, encouraging, like he's trying to stir something up, but not really in a way.
I like that. The kind of stir something up. I think that's a great depiction of what Malcolm's up to. Aurelia, you ready?
Yeah, yeah. Um, okay, so what I wrote for like the comparison, I wrote that when they compare, well, you can see the difference in their approaches. For King's approach, it was more like a peaceful and a non-violent demonstration, whereas Malcolm X's approach was to like first make a peaceful and non-violent demonstration, but then if it didn't lead to any results, they would have to resort to violence. And for the similarity, I put that, well, they both advocate for oppressed people across the globe, and they both think that uniting would make them stronger, as like so that it's more powerful, like they make it, yeah, like more powerful. And to me, it was pretty shocking how towards the end of his speech he discusses the possibility of an untimely death, and then the following day after he delivers his speech he was assassinated. And it's just crazy, like, to think that like he already saw it coming, he don't know when, but it was just crazy.
Yeah, that's and that's similar to both of them, right? Both Malcolm and Martin. Except for Malcolm, it wasn't the next day; it was that in that moment, while giving the speech, that he was assassinated. But you guys, I think you all touched on some really fecund and fascinating points about the speech. I could tell that you were listening closely. But I did want to pose this question to Sergio and Lilia, just because you guys both draw the very clear distinction between Dr. King being nonviolent and Malcolm being violent, right? And this is also in lieu or in line with the thinking of how we're giving presented these two figures, right? We are presented with them being on opposing ends, and those opposing ends, one being violent, one being nonviolent. Um, Before I get to the question, keep in mind, right? Malcolm himself never engaged in any type of violent acts, right? Never on paper did he ever engage in any act of violence. So just keep that in mind. But in Dr. King's speech, he makes the claim of nonviolence or non-existence. Okay, and think about if you guys remember that, but just think about what that means: nonviolence or non-existence, right? And compare that to what Malcolm X is saying with the ballot or the bullet, right? What do you guys think about those juxtapositions? And it doesn't have to just be Sergio or Elia. Anyone can answer, but I just, because you guys mentioned that in your fishbowl, I'm posing it to you, right? So to take a step back, what do you think the claim of nonviolence or non-existence means? It's an open question. So what does nonviolence mean?
From how I see it, I would say that being non-violent and non-existent are the same thing, because violence makes their presence clear, like, hey, we're here, we exist, but they're showing that through the violence that they cause. Whereas if there wouldn't be no violence, I guess people wouldn't be, or they wouldn't know that they exist. They'll just like be like everybody else, just push them aside and be like, hey, you're not really that important to us, but not exactly like that. Is what I'm trying to say.
No, but like, so the only reason I laugh, Victor, is because like I agree with what you're saying. I just don't know if that's what Dr. King is saying when he says that. But what you saying to me, like we on the same page with that one. Like I'm locking step with you on that. But I don't know if Dr. King would agree. Um, what are other thoughts? What do you guys think this distinction between nonviolence or non-existence? What do you think King was trying to get at with that claim? Nonviolence or non-existence?
I think that non-violence would be like hurting others to get what you want. I guess
That
like
would
no,
nonviolence?
yeah, like for example, like not doing what white people were doing to African Americans during the time, like using violence to oppress them.
Gotcha.
And I guess Martin Luther King didn't want like to like for African Americans to do the same thing.
Yep. So how would you situate that, Yasmin? Because you're absolutely correct. How would you situate that with the claim of non-existence, right? Because he's saying it's either or, just like it's the ballot or the bullet, right? So he's
Yeah.
saying it's either non-violence or non-existence. So where do you think the non-existence part comes in? Has anyone heard the metaphor eye for an eye leaves everyone blind?
Yeah.
So that's kind of what Dr. King is getting at, right? Like an eye for an eye leaves everyone blind. What does that mean?
I guess using violence to resolve violence that's already there doesn't help anything.
Yep. Yep. And kind of looking at the chat, two wrongs doesn't make a right. Yes. And then think of so take this concept and apply it to what King is saying, right? So if we don't take up this task that I'm trying to push forward for this country of being a non-violent country, right? And another thing that gets often misinterpreted by Dr. King, yes, absolutely, he was saying for black folks to be nonviolent, right? For black folks not to respond in kind to the way that the oppressor is inflicting violence upon him. That's absolutely what he's saying. But he's also advocating for the oppressor themselves to be nonviolent, right? That's why the whole his stance, anti-war stance against the Vietnam War, it falls right into this critique of nonviolence, right? I can't be about nonviolence, but then support the country going to war in Vietnam and causing violence overseas, right? So this notion of nonviolence is not intra-community, right? And when I say intra-community, I just mean it's only applied to one community. He looks at this as a universal principle, okay? So if this is the case, he says, if we don't, as a society, take up this notion of nonviolence, we will no longer exist as a society, right? And this is why he says nonviolence or non-existence. right? Now think about what Malcolm is saying in The Ballad or the Bullet. If you don't give us the political means that are owed to us, that we deserve, right, then you're going to have to deal with this bullet, right? So really, if you think about it and you kind of step away from the stories that we've been told about King and the stories that we've been told about Malcolm and the bifurcation between violence and nonviolence, they're really saying the same thing, right? What's the difference between nonviolence and non-existence or the ballad or the bullet? It's the same. It's the same claim, right? Either you do right by people or violence will ensue. Either you or, right, to take it a step further, if you do not do this and you do not become nonviolent, then it's going to get to a point that we will no longer be on this planet, right? And then to take this notion of violence even further, think about the violence that capitalism, this institution, this culture, the economic system of capitalism is doing to the planet, right? Global warming, right? The eradication of the ocean, right? This is violence being conducted on the planet that's going to lead to non-existence. So in both circumstances, even though the style was different, right? You don't hear Dr. King calling white folks crackers and hunkies. He's not doing that, right? Malcolm maybe, but you're not going to hear that from King. But what they're saying, what they're advocating for, what they're calling for this country to be is exactly the same. And there's two forces at play, right? One, America wants you to be comfortable with King, a particular version of King, right? They want you to be comfortable with the I Have a Dream King. And then they want you to be uncomfortable with any aspect of Malcolm, right? So they're going to keep this bifurcation in place. Another thing that comes into play is as they get older, the two gentlemen, Dr. King, Malcolm X, as they get older and as they mature, their views on things and certain issues become more and more aligned. And keep in mind the temporality of the two speeches that we listened to and read. Both of them were, well, Dr. King was his last speech for sure, and we know Malcolm would make his transition that following year, right? So again, as they get closer to the end of their life, their visions and their means for organizing becomes more and more aligned. Okay, so let's open it up to a broader classroom conversation with the 40 minutes or so that we have left. What I also want to hear from you guys, though, is how did listening to this, the third question in the breakout rooms, how did listening to this kind of problematize or disturb or shift the way that you viewed Martin Luther King prior to hearing this speech? Or, you know, if you haven't heard this before, what was the effective response that you had heard listening to this?
Well, from my view, because this is the first time I heard that that speech, the whole entirety. I just heard that little section where it says I've been to the mountaintop, but this is the first time I heard the whole thing. And comparing it to the most known one where I Had a Dream, I would say they are different because I feel like in that speech, he's calling or he's representing his community as in what they wish from the government, like what they wish to be respected, they wish to be, to get their basic rights and everything, compared to this one where he doesn't state that they're already in the process of it, but he's like in kind of, he wants his community to embrace like, we started it already, so let's not give up.
Yeah.
Like we're in the process. And I see him kind of shifting a little bit more towards like how Malcolm X is, where they kind of like a strong view instead of asking the government for their wit, they're trying to take it. Like they want it. They know they're gonna get it, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, Victor. Who else? Who else had a response? You know, if it was your first time or not, or just kind of comparing the two speeches, this what you heard to I Have a Dream. Did y'all not read? I know Victor read. I know Sergio read, or not even, you didn't read. You just listened to it.
Professor,
Yeah.
I have more of a question for you about the speeches. In this time period when the speeches were read, it was to more speak out about their civil rights and whatnot. But there was like many people, I would say mostly people that were trying to oppress them to like that hear these speeches, they don't really think of like the message. They just more think, do you think, is more a question for you, if you think that someone when reading to this in this time period could have thought of ill intent instead of like we want change, like there when someone can hear this they think more of a this is more of a rebellion than change, if that makes sense.
Hell yeah, Claudia. I mean, that's why they got killed, right? Like that's which. If I hear your question correctly, and I'll rephrase it just to make sure that I'm hearing the question correctly. So in the time that these speeches were given, right? Were there a community or a segment of people who felt threatened by these speeches, who felt that these speeches were not necessarily about change, but about government overthrow, if you will, for just kind of put some words into your mouth, about possibly dismantling or undermining American normalcy, right? Is that kind of what you're asking, Claudia?
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah. So my question, my answer, my response would be the same. Hell yeah, like that. And again, that's why they killed him. I don't know how many of you guys seen or are familiar with the movie that recently came out, the Judas and the Black Messiah, about Fred Hampton, right? I haven't seen it, so I can't speak from the movie, but just to kind of give you guys a reference point for those who've seen it. Um, the and again, this is for me speaking without seeing the movie, but I understand the history of the moment, right? So if Fred Hampton is the protagonist of the movie, then J. Edgar Hoover and the CIA would be the villain, right? And J. Edgar Hoover is famous for saying in this, before I go there, who has heard of COINTELPRO? Or who has not heard of COINTELPRO? Let me put it that way.
I haven't.
Okay.
Yeah, I haven't heard it either.
Okay. So COINTELPRO is the counterintelligence program that was instituted by the CIA to spy on, to undermine, and to assassinate these figures like Martin Luther King, like Malcolm X, like Fred Hampton, like Huey P. Newton, like Marcus Garvey. The list goes on. Okay, and part of COINTELPRO was to tap your phone, was to bug your apartment, right? Was to say, for example, here's a good example. Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, right? They would send Malcolm X a letter saying that Martin Luther King was talking shit. And then they'll send Martin Luther King a letter saying that Malcolm X was talking shit. So that way they could create a dysfunction and disunity. Think about what Martin Luther King was saying, right? One of the biggest things that Pharaoh did was make sure that those who were enslaved did not get along, right? So these are the type of tactics that COINTELPRO used. Going a little bit further, forward in time, the 1970s, I believe it is. For those familiar with UCLA, they have a section on their campus that's called Bunchy Hall, right? And Bunchy Hall is named after Bunchy Carter, who was one of the infamous Black Panther leaders in Southern California. He was really responsible for converting the gangs, like the Slossons, like the businessmen, like they weren't the 60s at the time, they were the Slossons at the time. But they would take these gang members and then convert them into Black Panthers, right? So a lot of the LA gangs were either stopped being gang members to become Black Panthers, and then once the Black Panthers got eradicated, then they broke back up to form gangs. But here's what I'm saying all this to say this. There was the Black Panther Party, right? And then in California, there was called the US Organization, United Slaves. That's what US stood for. For those who are familiar with Cal State Long Beach, actually, and when we read the Ma'at reading, the author of that is Maulana Karenga. Maulana Karenga was the chairman or the figurehead of the US Organization, right? J. Edgar Hoover COINTELPRO, and the CIA stoked the flames of a beef between the Black Panther Party and the US organization. And it got so malicious that members of the US organization killed Bunchy Carter and John Huggins at UCLA while they were meeting to establish who would take over Black studies at UCLA. Would it be the Black Panther Party who would put together the curriculum, or would it be the US organization? So while they're meeting about this on the campus of UCLA, a shooting breaks out and John Huggins and Bunchy Carter are killed. But this beef, and this is what's important, this beef was all stemmed from the CIA, right? From COINTELPRO, okay? So another thing that J. Edgar Hoover, who is the figurehead of COINTELPRO, he is famous for saying, we must stop the rise of a Black Messiah. And that's why the movie Judas and the Black Messiah has that particular name, right? And it's also a play on Jesus, right? Because Jesus was betrayed by Judas, right? Fred Hampton was betrayed by someone who was in the Black Panther Party serving as a CIA agent. Okay, so this is a brief history of this thing called COINTELPRO. So to tie this back into Claudia's question, yes, and yes, so much so that they developed a whole intelligence programming to surveil, monitor, harass those who they thought would be a threat, right? And now COINTELPRO has evolved to the point that they don't need to tap our phones anymore because we let them in with our cell phones, right? They don't have to monitor where we're going because we'll post where our location is on Facebook, Instagram, et cetera, right? So what they were effectively able to do is to integrate the surveillance into our entertainment, or what we call social media. Are y'all with me on that? Did I lose y'all, or am I making sense? Okay, no, you don't know.
Yeah, kind of. I get it more.
Okay. So that's to answer your question, Claudia. And so another aspect of Black studies, of Pan-African studies, is this notion of the Black radical tradition, right? And this kind of goes to your question also, Claudia. It's like, that's why the tradition is only radical because they do not legitimize our attempts to naturalize our humanity. Does that make sense? Somebody explain to me what I'm saying with that. It only becomes radical because the powers that be do not want to legitimize our attempts to make our human capacities be normal. Somebody re-explain what I just said to me, please.
So the way I'm interpreting is people only see it or see these figures as extreme, like their methods are as extreme because of the programs and the government that puts that view on them.
Exactly, Victor. That's exactly what it is. Exactly what it is. The government is what makes it radical because they say that this is unacceptable or inappropriate, right? But and if you read closely, right, if you think about a lot of the claims that Malcolm makes, a lot of the claims that Martin Luther King makes, right, the whole formulation of this country was based on radical means, right? Give me liberty or give me death. No taxation without representation, right? These are radical ideas. So radical, in fact, that they left Europe, right? So what a lot of these people are arguing within the Black radical tradition is, why are we radical for doing this very same thing that you felt necessary to build this country? Go ahead, Claudia.
Professor, I actually wanted to add on to that a little bit. Please. And I'll also ask a question at the same time. Do you think most of the time this actually happens, like this division is happened by class? Because it's on history. If I look back to like Bacon's rebellion in the 1600s, it was about the poorest people, white and black, fighting together over British coloners. But what actually broke the rebellion is that the higher people from the higher classes, which was the British, said no, white people are actually better than the blacks, and that's when it started falling apart, because they didn't see each other as equals. Because once that division of classism and hierarchy started, everyone just started being like, no, I'm better, and then it just like then it became the blacks at the bottom. And I feel like that's like when you can really see how hierarchy and class really divides most of really causes the real division, I feel like.
Yeah.
And I feel like this is the whole point. Most of the speech is just to show that there's no real class. We're all humans at the end of the day. And then skin color, that's why I'm gonna refer just to the speech of Martin Luther King, but not this one about I Have a Dream speech, when he said that I hope that you're judged by the character, not your skin.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like that's what it's really trying to say, that specific speech of saying that there is no class, we're just humans.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Claudia. So I'm gonna respond to you in two ways. If you really, really want to get a very comprehensive understanding of that, there's a text or a book. It's called Capitalism and Slavery. The author of the text is Eric Williams. If you take so for example, I'm also teaching the Constitution class through Pan African Studies. We're reading that in that class. But what Eric Williams does is he really gets into this conversation around, is it a race issue or is it a class issue that's impacting subjected individuals within the United States? Eric Williams says, he argues that the institution of enslavement is by far and foremost a class situated institution, right? It's all about amassing capital. But what happens is racism comes into the fold because they have to justify why they're doing what they're doing, right? So again, think about Baldwin and the maintenance of white innocence. I'm going to devalue these individuals who we enslaved, so that way our actions don't seem inhumane and we don't seem unchristian, right? So yes, it's a class issue, right? And oftentimes class issues are manifested in the auspice or in the guise of race, right? Also, what becomes important, and I think this is something that a lot of Black feminist scholars or Black womenist scholars are able to really bring to the fore. If you have a chance to take Dr. Melina Abdullah's courses or Professor Stacey Mitchell's courses, they really deal with this idea of intersectionality, right? Has anybody not heard of the term intersectionality? Okay, so everybody knows what intersectionality is? Yes, no, maybe, kind of. I think so. Okay, so intersectionality is, so for example, so I'm just looking at the chat, right? Isis, Carla, and they commented in the chat. So Isis and Carla, correct me if I'm wrong. I'm assuming that you identify as women, right? So that's one area of your intersection. Excuse me. You're also could identify, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, as like Latinx, right, or what I would call indigenous, right? So those are your two intersections. You're a woman and you're indigenous, so that creates that intersection. So you could experience oppression because one, you're a woman, or because two, you're indigenous, right? Me, I'm a man and I'm Black, right? So my intersection is a Black male. Now, from the male side, right, I'm on the I typically don't get oppressed because of a male in a patriarchal society, right? But the majority of my oppression is experienced because of the color of my skin, right? So this is how intersection plays out. Another portion of intersection could be your sexuality, right? So you could be a Black male, but then you identify as homosexual. So then now you have a third intersection to where you could be oppressed because of your color. Maybe not so because you're a man, but because of your sexual orientation, that way you become oppressed. So another way to understand intersectionality is how your identities they intersect. Okay, so to bring in Claudia's conversation, black male, right? Black male, then my class. I'm underclass. If I'm an adjunct professor, I am not on the upper class, right? So that's another way where I could get oppressed, right? So I might be okay from being a man in a patriarchal society, but because I'm a black man and because I'm a underpaid black man, then that's another way to get oppressed, right? So, and that's why they say, and everyone likes to use the quote of Malcolm X, um, the most unprotected person on the planet is a black woman because of this notion of intersectionality, right? Because you know that they're going to be oppressed because they're black, and they're going to be oppressed because they're women, right? So that places them as the most oppressed individuals, right? So this is this idea or this notion of intersectionality. So, and I think where intersectionality becomes important, you don't have to get caught up in the conversation of saying, oh, it's just class or oh, it's just race, right? For those who are in the sociology or thinking about sociology, Marx, right? Karl Marx, they would consider one of the fathers of sociology. He is infamous for his class analysis. He's always looking at the issue of class. But what Marx fails to do is to look at race, right? So he does not have an intersectional analysis of social phenomenon, right? And that's one of the big things that we get from critical race theory, that we get from black womanist scholars, is this notion or this idea to be attentive to the intersections. Claudia, does that answer your question? Okay. So hopefully you guys went back and listened. If you didn't listen to Malcolm last week, you listened to him this time. We listened to Martin Luther King this week. And I know we talked about the tone, right? Victor mentioned the tone. He says it's kind of where Martin Luther King is very calm, right? But then Malcolm kind of want to stir some things up. What do you think about the location? Because this Martin Luther King speech was given in Memphis. Malcolm's speech was given in Detroit, right? Where do you think the role of the locale, right, the spatiality of the speech being given, how does that contribute to the style? How does that contribute to the tone being one way and the tone being somewhere in another way in Detroit? What do you guys think about that?
I would say it would reflect because Tennessee's in the South, right?
Mm-hmm.
So obviously in the South they have, or I feel like the African American people, that community is more targeted, or not just targeted, but they have more of a history of being, I guess just degraded, like put down compared to the people in the North with Detroit. So I feel that, well, Malcolm took place in Detroit, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes, sir.
So he would kind of want to wake those people up more and like encourage them, like, hey, just because you guys are not, or you guys have it a little bit better off than the people in the South, doesn't mean you guys don't have to push or fight for the basic rights or for what we're fighting for too. Like, you guys need to fight just as hard as the people down South or anywhere throughout the country. And whereas in the South, Martin Luther King, well, he knows that those people, they'll fight because they want what they deserve or what's owed to them. So he would kind of like, he wouldn't have to further encourage them because they're already at that level, but he would just have to like, kind of like, hey, continue up, like, don't stop now. We're halfway there. Or, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Victor. I thought you were going to go somewhere else, but I like really where you ended up because I think this is a little bit more fecund than what I thought you were going to say, to be honest with you. Go ahead, please, go for it.
Oh, sorry, I think I'm gonna go a little different route than what Victor said. I think in Detroit, since it is like how Victor said it was in the North, I feel you can make more commotion. You can make it more because people aren't really like it's already happening, so it's like you can make more noise. And in the South, I feel like since there is majority, it's known for the South, more white people, I feel like it was more mellow, so it can like you can settle in but also build it up quietly, so it's not so it's not present as something very shocking, but it's settling in, and then it's getting people to like quietly stand up until when they look around, they're like, oh, okay, we're actually doing this. And then one is to make noise and one is to like, I guess, inspire to like stand up.
You know, I really like where where you guys took the conversation, because and I think you're really both right, right? Um, and to Claudia's point, and I'll try to circle back to what I was going to say in regards to Victor's point. Um, you guys may not have heard of it. There's a term called the Great Migration, right? And what they when they say the Great Migration, they're typically referring to African people who fled the South because of the persecution, right? And you either go up north or you go to the West Coast, right? California in particular, a lot of people who get shipped or get sent to California are individuals who are not able to, or not willing to acquiesce or get along with the racial oppression of the South, right? My grandmother being one of them. She's from Oklahoma, from Tulsa, Oklahoma. And she just wasn't getting down with that racism shit. Like, she wasn't going for it. So to keep her safe, her family sent her out here, right, to California. A lot of people who make up the first migration to California from black folks, right, these are individuals who are not willing to lay down and abide by Southern normal racial rules, right? A lot of the same thing in New York. So if you think about that, you have to see that the people in the South, not to say that they're accepting the racism. That's not what I'm saying. But their response to it is not as, I'm gonna put air quotes on, hostile as those who were forced to move to the West or move up north, right? So in this also, you see that distinction, right? Because Malcolm could talk a little bit more reckless to the people in North because, shoot, they left the South because they felt the same way that he did, right? But then to Victor's point, he'll let you know that don't say the South. He says it in the speech that we heard last week. Anything north of the Canadian border is the South, right? So he's saying, what Victor is saying, don't get it confused just because you out here in New York or in Detroit or up north that you're not experiencing the same type of racism, right? It may feel a little bit different, but it's the same, right? So I think you guys both really hit the nail on the head. And then also, one thing that you guys didn't mention was religion, right? Like, Malcolm is a Muslim, Martin is a Baptist preacher, and you really hear the Baptist preacher and Dr. King, right? You hear it in the way that he gives the speech. You hear it in the very long pauses, right? Whereas Malcolm is like is an automatic weapon, like it's no stop, right? But Martin is like that shotgun that you gotta reload it so you don't get that little breath. It's a slower pace. I don't know if y'all been down south, but everything that they do down south is slow, right? Fast food out here, maybe 10, 15 minutes. Down there, that shit may take you an hour. Like, no bullshit. That's just how south the slow moves, right? So these are also the distinction that religion plays in the way that they are delivering their message, right? Although both were given inside of a church, you have to imagine, because of who Malcolm is, the crowd is going to be a little bit different juxtaposed to with the crowd that Dr. King would pull, right? I really appreciate Victor and Claudia, your guys' engagement with the conversation, but I want to give you guys a break for the last 10 minutes. Let's have somebody else comment who we haven't heard from today. We got John, we got Carla, and we got Yasmin. So,
Professor,
yeah,
I actually want to add one more thing. I think also what gives them a different, for both Malcolm and Martin Luther King, I believe what gives them also a different energy and tone to their speech is their reputation
mm-hmm.
reputation of who they are. Like Martin Luther King is more typically seen as a peace symbol and like very calm, very mellow, and Malcolm is more blunt and very outspoken, I believe.
Yeah, I want to give me 1 second, you guys. I want to show you something that to me is like one of my favorite, really one of my favorite things about Malcolm. Let me try to pull it up, and I'll share my screen. Give me 1 second. But I still want to hear from others on your thoughts. It could be anything about the reading, anything about about the speech, especially if I haven't heard from you today. Anybody? Get 2 more and we'll call it a day. Again, there's no right or wrong. Just say your thoughts on the speech.
I feel like Martin Luther King gave his speech in a more peaceful way as compared to Malcolm.
Okay. Yeah, but yes and no, right? Because like fundamentally, and I'm not saying that you're wrong, Carla, but like I just don't want us to fall in the trap of just repeating what everyone says, and I don't mean everyone in the class, but just what history tells us, right? Again, and that's why I said at the start of class, keep in mind that Malcolm he never engaged in any violence, right? Like he may have talked about it, but he never did anything violent himself, right? He never struck anybody. He never did not one violent act. So he's just as nonviolent as Martin Luther King was, right? But again, they want to develop this narrative that keeps them separate, right? So I'm not saying that you're wrong, Carla, but we've been kind of trained to think about these two individuals in this way of nonviolent and violent, right? But when in reality they were both nonviolent, you know. Malcolm was more comfortable with taking it to violence if it need be, right? Whereas that was not an option for Martin Luther King. But fundamentally, both men were nonviolent, you know. Let me get one more comment. I'll share my screen and we'll call it a day. So somebody we have not heard from. One more.
I say I agree. I was gonna share that right now too. That I feel like Malcolm X was more open to the idea of using violence, but wasn't like, oh, oh, that's our only method.
Right.
And then I was gonna say, like, looking at that, like analyzing both ways, I guess you could say. Like, I wonder what we would do in those situations. Like, will we go to violence to get what we want? And I feel like it's kind of difficult when people are using violence towards you to not want to use it back. So as like, I know what, like when Martin Luther King was saying we should use peace, and like we should just keep it peaceful. I think that's something that's hard to do, especially when people are using like violence and like calling you names
Yeah.
and trying to make you feel like less than.
Yeah. That's a really good point, Yasmin. And that's one thing that really doesn't get talked about enough, I feel, like just how courageous you have to be to practice nonviolence. Um, there's a book, The Autobiography of Stokely Carmichael, or Kwame Ture. I think we're going to read a little bit of him next week. But he talks about the training that you would have to go through to be ready to participate in nonviolent actions. And literally throwing smoke in your face, spitting on you, right? Getting burnt with cigarettes. Like this is the training. This is not what you would go through. This, I mean, you would go through this in real life, but you would have to get trained so you would be able to sustain that. I don't know about how many y'all. I don't know how many y'all have ever been to in a fight, but There's a human response to where you get hit. The natural thing is to hit back, right? So you have to really train your body not to respond in that way, right? So there's a bravery there that comes with taking up this task of nonviolence. Um, I couldn't. That's not in me. You know what I'm saying? You hit me, I'm hitting your ass back. There's no other there's no other way around that. And then to the question of what are we doing now? I mean, it's pretty much implicitly and explicitly being done. It's nonviolence still, right? Have you guys heard about any retaliation taken against any police officer or anybody for that matter who has done harm to Black and brown bodies? I haven't. And I believe if that were to be done, the way that this media is ran, that would be all over the media. There would be no way that you wouldn't hear about somebody shooting a cop back for killing an unarmed Black person or unarmed, person of color. Like you're gonna definitely hear about that. That's not gonna go under the rug, right? So you can't assume that it's not happening. You have to assume that we're just not being violent. We're taking up this task still of nonviolence. Think about when last summer and all the rebellions were taking place over the cities, right? Everybody was saying nonviolent, be nonviolent, be nonviolent, right? So we've been really conditioned to perceive this idea of nonviolence as the only means to legitimately protest, express grievances, or advocate for justice. So real quick, I'll share my screen of what I was going to show y'all. This is a letter, and I actually have a picture of the actual letter, but I couldn't find it. This is a letter that that Malcolm X sent to Dr. King once he left the Nation of Islam and was kind of out on his own, and he returned back from his pilgrimage to Mecca. So, Dr. Martin Luther King, St. Augustine, Florida, we have been witnessing with great concern the various attacks of the white races against our poor, defenseless people there in St. Augustine. If the federal government will not send troops to your aid, just say the word, and we will immediately dispatch some of our brothers there to organize self-defense units among our people, and the Ku Klux Klan will then receive a taste of its own medicine. The day of turning the other cheek to those brutes, beasts, is forever over. It's over, excuse me, I put that forever on there. But see, so, and the reason I brought this up, again, we've been trained to see these two individuals as separate, as not willing to work with one another, almost as enemies, right? But you could tell from hearing the two speeches, right? Ideologically, they were more aligned than they were apart, right? And then from what we just read now, from what Malcolm sent to Dr. King, he was willing to show support. He was willing to actually send some of his men down there and put their lives on the line and train the people in the civil rights movements on how to defend themselves, right? So again, one of the premier goals of this unit, of this section, and you guys having these two speeches, is to disturb this notion of them being separate, to disturb this notion of them being enemies, right? And really to see how Martin Luther King was a lot more radical than people give him credit for. And, Malcolm X was a lot more forthcoming and a lot more willing to work with individuals who history tries to say he was not willing to. Any last questions, comments, or concerns? All right, I'm going to show you guys what our reading is for next week, and we'll call it a day. All right. So for next week, let's see. Watch this for sure. Yeah, so we'll do H. Rod Brown and Stokely Carmichael. So watch that, and then we're going to read this one. From Black Power to Pan-Africanism. It's not a lot. This is by Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, who I was mentioning earlier. But these will be your assignments for this week. Watch. Oh, shit, my fault. So watch H. Rod Brown, 12-minute YouTube clip, and then read from Black Power to Pan Africanism. If you guys want to engage that, you feel free. That could be like an extra credit assignment. But just assigned material is the H. Rap Brown video and the Kwame Ture Black Power to Pan Africanism. Okay. Are there any question anyone has for me?
Yeah, I had a question. So we do a separate journal entry for those two things, right? So
You
we'd
can do them
have two.
together. Yeah. And if you want, thank you, Victor. That's a good question. You could just choose. If you could either do your journal on the video or you could do your journal on the reading, whichever one speaks to you the most. It doesn't matter to me.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions, you guys?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Or it's more like, can you let me know if I already completed my fish bowls for the semester?
Yeah.
Or
You know, this is what I'll do. By the end of this week, I'll send out a document to let everybody know where you are with your fish bowls. I'll do it for the whole class. And then if you have two, you're done for the semester. If you only done one, then you have one more to go. And if you've done none, you need to kind of get on it because we're running out of time. How does that sound?
thank you.
Cool.
That sounds good. Thank you.
Any other questions?
I have a question. I did a fishbowl on Monday, which is usually when like I'm assigned to this class, and then I did one on Wednesday, group B.
Yeah, that's your two. That's fine.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? All right, y'all. Have a good week. Stay healthy. Stay safe.